In 1913, two laws were passed in the United States that most people have never studied side by side, not because the information is hidden, because nobody teaches them together. And when you put them together, when you look at what was promised and what actually happened, a very different story emerges from the one most people were taught in school. The first was the 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution, ratified on the 3rd of February 1913. It gave Congress the permanent power to tax income. When it passed, less than 1% of Americans paid any income tax at all. The exemption was set so high that the overwhelming majority of working people were entirely untouched. It was sold explicitly as a tax on the wealthy, a tool to make the robber barons finally contribute their fair share. The politicians who voted for it said it would never reach into the pockets of ordinary Americans. The second was the Federal Reserve Act, signed into law on the 23rd of December 1913, 3 days before Christmas, when most of Congress had already gone home for the holidays. It created a central banking system that had been designed in secret 2 years earlier on a private island in Georgia by a group of men who represented the largest financial institutions in America. They had traveled there in disguise, using only first names, with borrowed shotguns as cover. The system they designed was presented to the public as a safeguard against financial panic, a protection for ordinary depositors, a mechanism to stabilize the economy for everyone. Both laws were presented as protections for ordinary Americans against concentrated wealth. Both became something else entirely. The income tax that was supposed to never touch working people now reaches into the paycheck of virtually every employed American before they ever see the money. The dollar that existed before the Federal Reserve was created in 1913 could today buy you approximately 3 cents worth of goods and services. The national debt that stood at $2.9 billion in 1913 now stands at $39 trillion and climbing. And the wealth concentration that both systems were supposed to remedy has returned to levels not seen since the Gilded Age that preceded them. This is the documented story of how that happened. Through the slow compounding machinery of two systems designed by people whose interests were fundamentally different from the people they were designing them for, and through the oldest pattern in the history of financial legislation, the temporary measure that becomes permanent, the narrow tax that becomes universal, the emergency power that never expires. In 1913, they told you it was temporary. 112 years later, the machinery is still running. And the question of who it has actually served and who has paid the cost is one the primary sources have been answering for over a century. To understand why 1913 happened, you have to understand the world that preceded it. In the second half of the 19th century, the United States was industrializing at a pace that had no historical precedent. Steel mills roared across Pennsylvania and Ohio. Railroads stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Oil derricks punched into the Pennsylvania earth and black gold came flooding out. The economy was expanding at extraordinary speed. And a small group of men were accumulating wealth at a rate that made European aristocrats look modest by comparison. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, Vanderbilt. These were figures who moved markets, bought politicians, and ran the country from their private offices with an authority that no elected official could match. But beneath this surface, the financial system was structurally unstable in a way that produced catastrophic consequences at regular intervals. The United States had no central bank. The country had experimented with central banking twice before. The first Bank of the United States was chartered in 1791. The second Bank of the United States was chartered in 1816. Both had been killed off because the American public was deeply and correctly suspicious of concentrated financial power. Andrew Jackson, who destroyed the second bank in the 1830s, made no secret of his position. He believed it was a tool of the wealthy elite to extract money from ordinary people. He called it a monster. For a while, his view won. Without a central bank, the American financial system ran on a patchwork of state-chartered banks, national banks, and a growing sector of lightly regulated institutions called trust companies. These trust companies operated like banks, holding deposits and making loans, but they were subject to far fewer rules. They were faster, looser, and far more dangerous. Between 1863 and 1907, the United States experienced at least 5 major financial panics. Roughly every 15 years, the economy would seize up. Banks would fail. People would rush to withdraw their savings and find the vault empty. Factories would shut. Workers would be thrown into the streets. There was no safety net. There was no mechanism to inject liquidity into a failing system. When panic struck, it was a matter of who was strong enough to survive and who went under. Each panic was an improvised disaster with no institutional response and no structural lesson applied. The vulnerabilities that caused each crisis remained entirely unchanged when the next one arrived. The panic of 1907 was different. It was more severe, more widespread, and it exposed something about the nature of power in American finance that could no longer be comfortably ignored. It started with an act of spectacular financial overconfidence. A group of speculators attempted to corner the market on United Copper Company stock. They borrowed heavily, they bought up shares. They planned to squeeze anyone who would bet against them. When the scheme collapsed, the banks and trust companies that had lent them money suddenly looked extremely vulnerable. Depositors started getting nervous. In October 1907, a run on New York's trust companies began. Within days, the stock market had lost nearly half its value from its peak the prior year. Trust companies across the city were hemorrhaging deposits. The Knickerbocker Trust, one of the largest in New York, slammed its doors on customers who could no longer access their own money. Real gross national product fell 11%. Clearinghouses in 73 cities partially suspended cash payments. The entire financial system appeared to be approaching total collapse. And into this chaos walked one man. Not a government official. Not an elected representative. A private banker named John Pierpont Morgan. Morgan was 70 years old in 1907. He gathered the presidents of New York's most powerful banks into his private library on Madison Avenue. He had his people go through the books of struggling institutions and decide which ones were worth saving. Then he locked the library doors. The bankers could not leave. Morgan stood by while his aides prepared a pledge. Each man was assigned a sum of money to commit to the bailout. Around 4 a.m, exhausted men finally signed their names. Morgan had his resolution. The panic was brought under control. And the public reacted with something between awe and deep unease. Yes, the crisis had been stopped. But stopped by whom? A private individual had decided largely on his own judgment which institutions would live and which would die. He had performed the functions of a government without being one. The question that hung in the air was obvious. What happens next time if J.P. Morgan is not around or not willing to intervene? Congress responded by forming the National Monetary Commission, chaired by Senator Nelson Aldrich, a Rhode Island Republican deeply connected to the banking world who happened to be John D. Rockefeller's father-in-law. Aldrich spent several years studying central banking systems in Europe and formulating a plan for an American version. That plan would come together in a meeting that almost nobody knew about for 2 decades. If you have not subscribed to the channel yet, please do it now. This is exactly the kind of financial history we cover. The documented mechanisms behind the events that shaped the modern world. Every subscriber genuinely matters to what we are building here. Now hold that picture in your mind. A financial system that has produced 5 catastrophic panics in 50 years. A private banker who has twice saved the United States economy through personal force of will. And a senator with deep banking connections tasked with designing the permanent solution. Because what happened next is one of the most consequential and deliberately concealed acts of institutional design in American history. And it happened on a private island in Georgia where the men involved were using false names and carrying borrowed shotguns. In November of 1910, Senator Aldrich organized a trip that officially did not exist. He invited a small group of men to board his private rail car in New Jersey, travel south to Georgia, and spend 9 days at the Jekyll Island Club, an exclusive retreat for the ultra-wealthy perched on a barrier island off the Georgia coast. At the time, members of the Jekyll Island Club collectively controlled an estimated 1/4 of the world's wealth. The men who made that trip used first names only during travel to avoid being recognized. Paul Warburg brought duck hunting equipment even though he had never shot a duck in his life. The cover story was a hunting excursion. Nobody there was interested in ducks. They were there to design the architecture of American money. The attendees included Aldrich himself, Henry P. Davison, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan & Company, Charles D. Norton, president of J.P. Morgan's First National Bank of New York, Benjamin Strong, who would go on to become the first head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Frank Vanderlip, president of National City Bank, the most powerful bank in America at the time, and Paul Warburg, a German-born banker and partner at Kuhn Loeb & Company, an institution with deep ties to the Rothschild banking network in Europe. That is a remarkable list. Between them, these men either controlled or were directly connected to the most powerful financial institutions in the United States. They were not there as public servants. They were there as private financial competitors who had temporarily decided to cooperate. And what was the actual problem they were trying to solve? Not, as they would later tell the public, the instability of the American banking system for the benefit of ordinary depositors. The problem from their perspective was competition. By 1910, state-chartered banks not affiliated with the major New York institutions had grown explosively. By the time the Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913, these non-national banks made up 71% of all American banks and held 57% of the nation's deposits. American companies were also increasingly financing their own expansion from profits rather than relying on the big banks for loans. The grip of the major financial institutions was slipping. The goal at Jekyll Island, stripped of all its public interest language, was to design a system that would allow the largest banks to function as a coordinated cartel, protecting themselves from competition and using the authority of government to enforce their arrangement. Crucially, they needed this to look like a government institution. They needed it to carry the seal of public authority while actually operating in the interests of private finance. And they were sophisticated enough to know that calling it a central bank was politically impossible. Americans had fought and won against central banks twice before. The word bank could not appear prominently in the name. Paul Warburg, the most technically sophisticated monetary economist in the room, solved the problem. He proposed wrapping the reality of central control in the language of decentralization. Instead of one central bank, they would create a system of 12 regional banks. The whole thing would be called the Federal Reserve System. Federal made it sound like a government operation. Reserve made it sound prudent and responsible. System made it sound like infrastructure rather than a cartel. They worked from early morning to late at night for more than a week. Frank Vanderlip later wrote in his autobiography that he had been part of a group that disappeared from the world onto a deserted island and put in the most intense period of work he had ever experienced. The plan they produced was detailed, technically sophisticated, and politically disguised. It made its way into the legislative process, was renamed and rebranded as a Democratic bill after Republicans took losses in the 1910 midterms, and was passed by Congress on December 22, 1913. Woodrow Wilson signed it into law the following day. Benjamin Strong, who had investigated the Knickerbocker Trust books during the 1907 panic on behalf of J.P. Morgan, became the dominant voice in the direction of the new Federal Reserve System for the next 15 years until his death in 1928. The people who had designed the system were now effectively running it. There is one additional detail that almost never appears in the standard account. When the Federal Reserve Act was passed, it included a 20-year charter. The Federal Reserve was technically a temporary institution subject to renewal. In 1927, the McFadden Act quietly rechartered the Federal Reserve banks in perpetuity, eliminating any expiration date or possibility of sunset. The institution that was sold partly on its impermanence became immortal, embedded permanently into the architecture of American monetary life without any significant public debate about whether permanence was what the country actually wanted. The Federal Reserve Act was not the only world-altering piece of financial legislation passed in 1913. The 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified on the 3rd of February 1913, and the Revenue Act of 1913, signed by Wilson in October of that year, put it into practice. Here is how it was sold to the American public. For decades, there had been growing fury about economic inequality. The gap between industrial barons and factory workers was visible and raw. Tariffs, the primary source of federal revenue at the time, fell hardest on consumers because they raised the prices of imported goods that everyone bought. The income tax, by contrast, was framed as a tool to make the wealthy finally contribute their fair share. And in its original form, the numbers supported that framing. The Revenue Act of 1913 exempted all income below $3,000 for single filers and $4,000 for married couples. In the context of 1913, wages that exemption covered the overwhelming majority of Americans. According to the National Archives, less than 1% of the population paid income taxes at all in 1913. The tax started at 1% for income above the exemption and reached a maximum of 7% for income above $500,000, equivalent to approximately $15 to $17 million annually in today's terms, less than 1% of the population. If you had told Congress in 1913 that within a generation that tax would reach into the pockets of nearly every working American, many of them would not have believed you. Some of them would have been horrified. The transformation happened faster than anyone publicly acknowledged it would, and it happened for a reason that was entirely predictable once the mechanism existed. War. By 1918, just 5 years after those modest 1% rates were introduced, the top income tax rate had been raised to 77%. The United States had entered the First World War, and the income tax, which had been designed with a high exemption to protect working people, had proven to be an irresistibly flexible tool for raising government revenue under pressure. By 1944, at the peak of Second World War financing, the top marginal rate reached 94% on incomes above $200,000. And the exemption had been slashed so dramatically that the income tax had become, for the first time, a mass tax paid by the vast majority of working Americans rather than a narrow tax on the wealthy. The 1942 Revenue Act, described by Franklin Roosevelt himself as the greatest tax bill in American history, dramatically lowered exemptions and introduced payroll withholding, making the income tax a universal reality for American workers for the first time. The withholding system was a stroke of behavioral engineering. When taxes are taken from your paycheck before you ever touch the money, you never experience the payment as a loss. The money was never yours in your hands. Milton Friedman, who helped design the withholding system during the Second World War, later called it one of the worst things he ever did. To understand just how dramatic the shift was, consider this single comparison. In 2010, the personal exemptions and standard deductions available to a married couple filing jointly totaled $18,700. The original 1913 married couple exemption of $4,000 was equivalent in inflation-adjusted terms to approximately $88,000. The modern exemption was barely 21% of the real value of the original one. The tax that was designed to only touch the top sliver of earners had been brought down to cover nearly everyone, while its real dollar exemption had been gutted to a fraction of its original intent. And the pattern that produced this outcome has a name. It is the oldest pattern in the history of financial legislation. The temporary becomes permanent. The narrow becomes universal. The emergency becomes the baseline. This is the kind of documented financial history that the standard account almost never tells you. If this channel is new to you, please subscribe now. So we now have two systems established in the same year by the same president. One designed in secret by private bankers to coordinate American monetary policy. One designed in public as a tax on the wealthy that has since expanded to cover virtually everyone. The question that serious financial history asks is not whether either system was well-intentioned. The question is what they actually did when you run them side by side for over a century and read what the data shows. The most visible consequence of the Federal Reserve's century of operation is what has happened to the dollar. In 1913, $1 bought what today costs approximately $32. According to Bureau of Labor Statistics data and Federal Reserve records, the dollar has lost approximately 97% of its purchasing power since the Federal Reserve was created. That figure deserves a moment of consideration. A dollar saved in 1913 and kept in cash would today buy approximately 3 cents worth of goods and services. The money supply that this purchasing power erosion reflects has grown dramatically. The M2 money supply, which measures all the dollars in circulation and in deposits, grew from roughly $4.6 trillion in the year 2000 to over $19 trillion in 2021. In 2020 alone, approximately 20% of all dollars in existence were created. Prices did not initially reflect this, but they caught up, producing the highest inflation rates in 4 decades by 2022. The standard defense of monetary expansion is that it is a feature, not a bug. That moderate inflation encourages spending and investment, and the people who hold their savings in productive assets rather than cash do not suffer this loss. That defense carries within it a deeply important admission. The system systematically rewards those who own assets and punishes those who do not. The people most likely to hold cash, the people most dependent on wages and least able to own significant financial assets, are the ones most exposed to the constant grinding erosion of purchasing power that monetary expansion produces. By 2010, approximately 72% of financial assets in the United States were held by the wealthiest 5% of the population. When the Federal Reserve creates money, lowers interest rates, or buys assets through quantitative easing, as it did on a massive scale after 2008 and again in 2020, the primary beneficiaries of rising asset prices are those who hold the most assets. The wealth transfer is quiet. It does not appear in any ledger as a transfer, but it is a transfer nonetheless, encoded in the structure of the system itself. The income tax interacts with this dynamic through a mechanism that economists call bracket creep. When the government does not index tax brackets for inflation, or indexes them imperfectly, rising nominal incomes push people into higher tax brackets, even when their real purchasing power has not increased. Workers who receive a pay increase that merely keeps pace with inflation find themselves paying a higher marginal rate in nominal terms. The combination produces a form of double extraction. Inflation erodes the purchasing power of wages, and the progressive tax structure then takes a larger nominal slice of those inflation-eroded wages. The Federal Reserve creates the ability to expand the money supply, which allows the government to run deficits and finance expenditure without immediately raising taxes in politically visible ways. Inflation then does the quiet work of taxation without legislation. The national debt trajectory makes the cumulative effect of these two systems visible in a single set of numbers. When the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, the United States national debt stood at roughly $2.9 billion. By 1930, it was $16 billion. By the end of the Second World War, it exceeded $269 billion. By 1980, it crossed $900 billion. By 2000, it was $5.7 trillion. It now stands at approximately $39 trillion and climbing. The Federal Reserve made this trajectory possible by functioning as a buyer of last resort for government debt and by holding interest rates artificially low for extended periods. Interest payments on this debt flow to whoever holds treasury bonds, disproportionately owned by financial institutions, the wealthy, and foreign governments. Those interest payments are covered by tax revenue collected from all working Americans. It is a transfer system, subtle but relentless. From wage earners to bondholders, operating every single day inside machinery so familiar that most people never stop to examine what it actually does. In 1913, the income tax accounted for less than 10% of federal revenue. By 1950, it accounted for 45%. By 1985, it accounted for nearly 73%. The transformation was total. A tax designed to be narrow and elite-focused had become the primary mechanism through which the American government funded itself, drawing from the wages of nearly every working person. The top rate has moved dramatically across the century, from 7% in 1913 to 77% in 1918, to 94% in 1944, to 50% in 1981 after Reagan's cuts, to 37% today. But through all these fluctuations, the bottom of the rate structure, the base from which ordinary earners pay, never returned to the world of 1913, where the majority of Americans paid nothing at all. There is a pattern in this history worth naming precisely. The most significant expansions of government power over economic life in American history have almost always been packaged as temporary, as narrow, as targeted at someone else. The first federal income tax was collected during the Civil War as an explicit wartime emergency measure. When the war was won, it was repealed in 1872. The second attempt in 1894 was struck down by the Supreme Court. The third attempt, the 16th Amendment, was presented as something narrow and targeted at the wealthy. In practice, what emerged was permanent, universal, and constantly expanding. The Federal Reserve was given a 20-year charter. In 1927, it was quietly made permanent with almost no public discussion. The emergency becomes permanent. The exception becomes the rule. The narrow measure becomes broad, and the costs which were supposed to be borne by the wealthy find their way down to everyone. The people who designed these systems were not naive. They understood what mechanisms they were building. The men who gathered on Jekyll Island were wealthy financiers who owned financial assets. They would benefit from asset price inflation driven by monetary expansion. They would not be hurt by wage erosion. The politicians who passed the income tax were trying to finance a government with a more just tax base than tariffs provided, and they succeeded in that narrow initial goal. But the unintended consequences of placing an infinitely flexible revenue mechanism in the hands of a government that regularly faces wartime emergency were entirely predictable to anyone who thought carefully about incentive structures. Whether those consequences were intended or merely permitted is a question the historical record does not fully resolve. What the historical record does resolve is what actually happened. The dollar has lost 97% of its purchasing power since 1913. Wealth concentration has returned to Gilded Age levels. The national debt represents a transfer of resources from future wage earners to present bondholders that compound silently every year. And the financial system remains in its essential structure organized around the interests of large institutions rather than ordinary depositors, exactly as the men on Jekyll Island designed it to be. The families who understood the system best built structures to benefit from it while insulating themselves from its costs. The Rockefellers used irrevocable trusts and insurance strategies to pass wealth across generations while minimizing estate taxes. The institutions that designed the Federal Reserve became its primary beneficiaries. For everyone else, the cost of the 1913 settlement has been paid quietly, in grocery prices that are higher every year in paychecks withheld before you ever see the money. In a dollar that buys less every decade, in a national debt that represents a burden accumulated through a mechanism that made the borrowing politically painless for those who borrowed and economically painful for those who must eventually pay. What 1913 ultimately created was a two-part machine. On one side, a mechanism for managing money that operates largely outside democratic accountability, controlled by an institution that is neither fully governmental nor fully private, that has enormous power over interest rates, asset prices and economic conditions, and whose decisions systematically transfer wealth upward through inflation and asset price appreciation. On the other side, a mechanism for taxing income that was sold as a check on inequality but became the primary funding instrument of an expanding state, with its heaviest burden falling on wage earners who cannot access the same shelters, exemptions, and loopholes available to those with capital. These two systems have operated together for over a century. The cumulative result is visible in the data, not as a conspiracy, as a system. Systems do not need conspirators to sustain them. They sustain themselves. They accumulate constituencies. They generate institutions with incentives to maintain themselves. And the people who know this best, who understand how the machinery operates and can use that knowledge to their advantage, are the same kind of people who built the machinery in the first place. The Jekyll Island meeting is in the record. The Revenue Act of 1913 is public law. The Federal Reserve's 1927 permanent recharter is documented. The dollar's 97% purchasing power loss is measured by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and Federal Reserve data. The income tax's expansion from less than 1% of Americans to virtually everyone is in the National Archives. This is not legend. It is the paper trail. And it tells a story about the relationship between financial architecture and democratic accountability that is considerably more disturbing than any conspiracy theory, because it requires no conspiracy. It requires only that the people who design systems design them in their own interests, and that the rest of us take a very long time to read what those systems actually say. If this is the kind of forensic financial history you have been looking for, please subscribe to the channel. And if this video changed how you think about a story you thought you already knew, share it with someone who still believes the income tax was always meant for them. Leave a $sign in the comments if you made it to the end. It seemed appropriate. I will see you in the next one.